All right, welcome everyone. It's good to see you all or to be seen by you all. So my name is Reverend Bryson White, and I'm the Regional Faith Coordinator for Faith in the Valley. And welcome to another conversation of Faith in the Valley's Justice Interview Series. So a little bit about Faith in the Valley. As many of you already know, Faith in the Valley and our community partners believe a different and better future is possible for the Central Valley if we work together. A future in which everyone is included, treated as sacred, has a chance to thrive and live a healthy, decent life. A future in which no one is seen as less than or lives in fear because of the color of their skin, their legal status, their religious affiliation, or the amount of money they earn. A future where everyone has access to good jobs, clean air, clean water, alternatives to incarceration, quality healthcare, and safe neighborhoods. This Faith in the Valley Justice Interview Series, there are a set of conversations that highlight the role of faith and justice in organizing in the Central Valley. We have discussed so far the role of interpretations of Scripture and its role of biblical Scripture and its role in doing justice, the intersection between Christian religion and mass incarceration, Christian perspectives on abolitionism, conceptions of nonviolence, the revolutionary theology of Fannie Lou Hamer, amongst other topics. Today, we are grateful to have Hajj Reza Nekumanesh as a conversation partner discussing a critically important issue, the oppressive plight of Palestinian people. So a brief bio from Hajj Reza, who is the executive director of the Islamic Cultural Center of Fresno, has been serving the Muslim community in Fresno for more than 20 years. He is a strong advocate for social, racial, and economic and environmental justice and intra-faith understanding and cooperation. In 2018, Reza was honored with the Way of Peace Award from the Fresno Center for Nonviolence for his work to bring about greater justice for all communities in Fresno. In 2019, Reza was recognized as one of Fresno's unmasked heroes for his work to fight for the underserved, marginalized, and unheard masses of the population. In 2017, his work was highlighted in a national campaign, which is still on display in Washington, D.C., called Facing America, that highlighted the work of those struggling to bring about justice and honor for all immigrant communities. A strong advocate for social justice, he has worked at the local, state, and national levels in fighting for immigration reform, housing justice issues, sanctuary law, reducing police violence, and many other issues. In working to promote the faith of Islam, the work of the interfaith community, and to highlight the struggles of the marginalized, Reza's work and interviews have been featured in over 100 print and television stories, podcasts, and documentaries. Among dozens of others are the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Miami Herald. I don't know how to pronounce this family. Ikama magazine. How do I pronounce that?
That's right.
Okay, Ikama magazine, Islamic Horizons, and the powerful podcast led by Michael Ray Matthews, Prophetic Resistance. So grateful to have you today, Reza. This is a really cool bio that you sent. I've known you for some years, and I didn't know all of these things, so it's cool to read some of that. So let's get to it. Let's ask some questions, and I'm looking forward to learning from you, and hopefully those who are in attendance virtually will be able to learn from you today as well. So the first question that I have for you is, can you help our listeners in the Central Valley or wherever they are listening from understand the origins of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and what popular myths do you think we need dispelled?
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Bryson, for having me. Thank you to the Faith in the Valley family. If I can start in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. All praises due to Allah, the one Lord of the worlds, the creator and master and sustainer of the worlds. And may peace and blessings be upon all of his prophets, including the final prophet, Prophet Muhammad, and upon his purified progeny. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon all of you. I think since today, and always, it's always good, but since today we're going to be talking about indigenous peoples, land, displacement. We need to begin with a land acknowledgement. So I come to you standing upon stolen land. This is the land of the Yokuts people. So I acknowledge that this land was occupied by civilizations, and they were colonized by colonial settlements. And then again, before we start, I really need to share that we need to be able to have these conversations And there are going to be difficult conversations about the state of Israel, about those who rule over the Palestinian people, that oppress the Palestinian people, that suppress the Palestinian people. And I think that sometimes there's a charge levied that when you talk about the state of Israel, it's anti-Semitism. And I think we really need to have an understanding today and always that talking against the state of Israel, being an anti-Zionist, is not being anti-Semitic. And I know that's difficult for some of our listeners to understand, but the reality is that you can absolutely be against any power, any state, any land without being against a people, right?
Mhm.
So when I talk about the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, I'm not against Muslims. When I talk about the government of Iran, I'm not against Shia Muslims. I am from the Shia perspective. So we really need to have an understanding that talking about power, talking about authority, talking about oppression is not about a people. You know, I have much love for our Jewish brethren. You know, Jewish brothers and sisters are near and dear to my heart. They are raised up in the Quran along with Christians and other faiths called Ahlul Kitab. People have been given the book. People have been given the scripture. So when we talk today, we are going to be talking about Zionism and Israel particularly. So this is not a charge against any Jewish peoples. So first of all, when we talk about the history of Palestine, you know, we're going to have to go back thousands of years. And I'm so grateful that I'm thinking a lot of your listeners, Bryson, are hopefully theologians of some sort. We have a lot of Christian theologians among us. So I think this is not going to be new to you. You know, the first great migration of peoples to the land that is Palestine was the Canaanites. And we're talking about, you know, forever ago. I don't really know how many millennia ago that was. There were people there. We know that archaeology shows that there were people living there, you know, 8,000 years before the Common Era. But the Canaanites was the first great migration of human beings towards that era, the first kind of important migration that would change history. And then we're going to have to, when we talk about the history of Palestine, we're going to have to talk about it from a biblical, from a religious lens, because there are things that happen to create that state, to create that space, that are documented in our religious texts. So you can't talk about the creation of Israel without talking about Abraham, the prophet Abraham. And I know that that's a biblical claim, that's a Quranic claim, but it's something that we have to talk about. We don't have like some external history about who Abraham was. We have biblical and Quranic teaching. So we know that Prophet Abraham was from the land of Mesopotamia. He lived in Ur, that is modern day Iraq. He migrated to the land, which is Palestine, something like 3,000 something years ago, before the Common Era. So about 5,000 something years ago. We don't really know exactly when. He had a child named Isaac, who also is a prophet. And then he had a child named Jacob, and Jacob's name is Israel. So the children of Israel would be the descendants of Jacob. So these are the people that end up also inhabiting and being important in the creation of this space. You know, the land was given the name Palestine by a Cretan tribe that invaded and ended up merging with the Canaanites something around 1200 before the Common Era. So the land was given the name Palestine around, 3,300 years ago. So it's been called Palestine, longer than most places have had their name around the world. And we flash forward to another great biblical story. We talk about like David and Solomon and their kingdom, and they were able to set up a very good, vast kingdom that was that allowed Israelites to rule for I guess around 400 something years. I'm not sure the exact time. I apologize, but our biblical theologians online, I'm sure they can look that up for us. After that, the land of Palestine was invaded by the Greeks, the Persians, the Arab Nabateans, the Romans. And then in around the year 635, it came under the rule of the Muslim Khalifa. And then later on, you have the Crusades, the Crusaders and the Vatican who came and kind of terrorized the land for a couple centuries. And then Muslims then reconquered the land and took back Jerusalem. So it's a pretty interesting history of the space of the land that is Palestine. And there were a lot of people that had claim to the land, that lived at the land, that conquered the land, that were there. But what we do know is throughout that entire time, No matter who invaded, no matter who got involved, no matter who was in charge, they all had a Palestinian identity. So being Palestinian, this Palestinianness was there for all of them. And then we flash forward until, the modern era. We look at 1917 when Palestine is taken over, when the Turks were defeated by the Brits. So they took over the area and then called it the British Mandate of Palestine. We can't forget, not that many years later, a crime against humanity was waged against our Jewish brothers and sisters in Europe by Europeans, not by Muslims. Let's keep that clear because it's important to what happens later on. But the Holocaust happens, a terrible tragedy and genocide against Jewish brothers and sisters. And because of that, there is a sense that when Germany is defeated, that there needs to be a space for Jewish people to have a national state. And mind you, I do need to go back. The idea of Zionism, of the idea that there is a Jewish nationalism, that there should be a Jewish state, it goes back to the late 1800s, but it comes into existence in 1948. In 1948, the powers that be, the other oppressive powers that be, the United States, Britain, along with the United Nations, decide that they were going to carve out a piece of what was Palestine, and it was going to be a Jewish state, a Jewish-run, a Jewish-controlled state. The U.S. president at that time was Truman. It's interesting. If you go on Truman's own library web page, you can see the conversations that he had with his own aides about the creation of Israel, whether or not he was going to accept the state of Israel. So there was a play even in the United States, a push. Do we accept this state? Are we going? Because the reality was, we're going to get to one of the myths in a second. I want to talk about the myth that it was an empty land. It was. I just shared a great history. But anyhow, and then, we look at since then there was, a great push between folks. Like, what happens? Even early on, I want to share one of the great theologians. He's not obviously thought of as a theologian. He's a revolutionary, an activist, a love bringer. Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, brother Malcolm X. When he talked about the creation of Israel, he said that the Zionist argument to justify the present occupation of Arab Palestine has no intelligent or legal basis in history. So we're talking about a creation of a state that they're trying to lay a historical claim to and say that it should have been and always was Israel. But we have maps and books and documents for thousands of years that say, no, it wasn't. It was Palestine. And yes, Muslims, Christians, Jews, other religions, non-religious people all lived there peacefully, other than when they were being invaded. And then we flash forward till today, and we're going to talk about what's going on there today. But what's going on today is just a magnification, a carrying out of terrible policies set forth by the state of Israel. And we can't forget, by the way, I want to mention that there was a series of events that are very important in history. First of all, you had, with the 1948 creation, you have hundreds of thousands of Palestinians that were displaced and pushed into exile. That's the Nakba. You hear about the Nakba, which means the catastrophe. You can see the 6-day war that happened. You can see the annexation of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights. You can see the 1982 invasion of Lebanon by Israel. You can see the first Intifada. You can see the Oslo Peace Accords. So really, somebody could spend some time looking up these things that I'm just throwing out at you really quickly, and then get a better understanding of why there is so much strife in the area that is Palestine. But since then, since 1948, when Israel was given a tiny portion of a huge swath of land, or it's not huge, a huge swath of land. Since then, settlements have grown in such that now Israel controls the vast majority of the land, and the land that they don't control is under siege, under military siege and occupation by the state of Israel. They call Gaza the world's largest open-aired prison because people, by all means, are living in a prison where their movement is restricted. They can't do it. They don't have access to water. They don't have access to resources. And this is the reality of the state of Israel. And we're going to get to that, of course. But I just got to throw that out. I want to touch on just a couple of the myths that maybe exist. First, I said it. The first myth is that The Palestinian territory was an empty, uncivilized land, and those who lived there for thousands of years, they were just all too happy to have European colonial settlers bring in democracy and civilization. And we hear that time and time again. Before Israel, it was an uncivilized land. No, it was just a land that you European colonial settlers don't understand. It was a village land. It was a land of farming. It was a land where the people were connected to the earth, much like our indigenous brothers and sisters here in this land. And secondly, there's a terrible myth that I get told all the time, that if Hamas or other militant groups would lay down their arms, if there was no Hamas, if Iran was not such a great threat to the security of Israel, then we would have peace in the region. And these are myths. These are terrible lies. Firstly, it's the same brainwashing tactics that they use to talk about the need to militarize, the need to have a gargantuan military presence around the world to defend us and defend off attacks, never understanding that the truth is that if you didn't colonize a people, if you didn't murder a people, if you didn't strip them of resources, there probably will be no need to have a military to defend. What are you going to defend?
That's right.
But they say that if Hamas didn't exist, then there would be peace. Well, guess what? Hamas didn't come into existence until the first Intifada. So we're talking about decades after the existence of Israel. And for those decades, they were slaughtering Palestinians. They were forcing Palestinians into exile. So there wasn't peace. The idea that
can you give us a time, Reza? The first Intifada. Can you give us a time for listeners?
Yeah. So terribly, I don't recall the first Intifada, and I know that's terrible. It's just I'm not really good with dates.
Yeah. I didn't mean to interrupt, but just for folks who might
okay.
Need a reference point.
You know, hey, maybe you could look it up for me while we're doing this.
Yep.
Just so, and then the idea that if Iran wasn't involved, there would be peace. Well, guess what? That's just, again, not true, because until the Iranian Revolution in 1979, Iran was ruled by an authoritarian Shah, a king, who was friendly with Israel, who worked with Israel. And during all of that time, there was still murder, genocide, and expulsion of Palestinian people. So these are myths. They're lies. They are told to make people feel better. Oh, if people didn't cause problems, there wouldn't need. Well, guess what? If people on the street didn't break windows, you wouldn't need a militarized police. Does that make any sense? No.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, that's a really good frame, and I appreciate. Not only are you helping us sort of dispel myths where state-sanctioned violence is always demonizing those that it's expressing its violence upon, and saying that we have to have these large security apparatuses to protect ourselves from the violence that we're actually doing in the world. And you've also provided us a good overview of the land. And I'm really drawn to your first piece where you lifted up the mythology of that there was nobody occupying that land, right? You know what I mean? Because that myth right there is central to the Western racial colonial project, right? That nobody is there. You know what I mean? And we can go.
And if they're there, they don't matter, because they're not setting up civilization.
Exactly. You know what I mean? Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. Did you find the year of the Intifada?
Oh yeah, it's what I pulled up is 1987.
All right. Okay. Cool.
Yeah. I should know that also. I've been around some cool scholars doing some dope work on Palestinian causes.
Hey, Bryson, if you asked me what year I met you, I wouldn't even know that. I'm sorry.
Come on. Yeah. Okay, cool. Is there more that you want to touch on around mythologies?
No, the entire myth that has created the state of Israel that continues to occupy Palestine, it's in its entirety is a myth. And I don't call religious stories myths, but if you just want to look at it, use the word myth not as a false story, but of a story of a folklore or for an existence of being. Even the idea that a land was created for a particular people, you can say that's a myth as well. Maybe it's a religious belief that some hold, but even that you could. So it's layers upon layers upon layers, and you hear it every time you hear somebody defending the state of Israel. Another myth. Oh, they weren't civilized. oh, they didn't do anything but have farms. They weren't democratic. They didn't know how to rule themselves. You know, it
Right.
goes on and on and on. And all I do is hear these lies. The problem is most of us are brainwashed, and we hear it enough that we're like, oh my God, they were an uncivilized people. And thank God these people from Poland and Russia and Germany and Brazil went and established Israel. Because by the way, that's the reality that Israelis, you know, there were Jewish people that lived in that land for as long as Jewish people have existed in that land. But they were a very small percentage of people. The people that are Israelis, all of their politicians, their military, some of them might have been born in Israel if they're born after 1948, but all of their parents came from Russia, Germany, United States, Brazil. None of them are indigenous to that land. None of them have had their great grandparents didn't live there.
That's right. Yeah, no, that's right. And that's such an important piece to highlight for folks, because someone like myself, who's a part of, you know, the Christian tradition, a part of the Abrahamic family, you know, I grew up with the narrative that you know, that this was Israel's land. You know what I mean? That this was like the divine will, the divine right for them to occupy that space. You know, and that's just, you know, that was, you know, that's passed down in terms of how we think about even the book of Joshua, right, and the conquest narratives, and then how that becomes sort of rearticulated around, well, you know, Joshua, you know, wiped out, you know, this population, you know, on behalf of God, so Israel can do the same, right? So in a lot of our Christian communities, we come up under this narrative that's a very pro-Zionist, anti-humanitarian narrative, right, that sort of solidifies the oppression of Palestinian people within our theological imagination. And it takes, you know, hearing information like this and reading and entering into relationships, you know what I'm saying, with Palestinian folks, to have those narratives challenged and unsettled. You know what I mean? Because I grew up right under those myths. We could talk a little bit more about that. I can give some more detail, but yeah. So I know there's folks who are on this call or who are listening that might be coming under those same myths. So I'm glad that you're dispelling that for us.
And I want people to read. You know, just go and read. Go read and you know what? Forget that. You don't want to read? Go on YouTube.
Yeah, watch some videos.
Full of people like sitting outside of their home that was their grandparents and their great grandparents' home, and they're sitting outside of it watching other people live there. Go watch those videos. You know, videos did a lot for us with police brutality here in these states. That's you know, right. It changed our narrative. We all knew that police brutality was a reality. Black Panther Party wasn't established for no reason.
Right.
So it existed. But with cell phones, we all had to watch George Floyd suffocate to death, and it changed the narrative. So if you watch these stories, if you watch these videos, you know, maybe that will change the narrative. Maybe that's the thing that's going to save us.
Yeah, that's definitely good. And maybe at the end of this, we have time. You can even just maybe think of a couple of pieces, or we can even talk offline, and I can send that out to our listservs around text and videos that people could be watching. Let me hit you with the second question, fam.
Sure.
The second question is around media. So the media typically covers events which highlight the perspective of powerful people and their interests over and against the vulnerable people and their flourishing. So the question is, what do we need to know about the current wave of violence that Palestinian people have experienced that may not receive adequate news coverage in the United States? You can say recent, around this recent event.
Yeah, let's just stick right now, because we can go on for days about how the news covers the tension between Palestinians and the state of Israel. But just recently, you know, we see that that Israel demolishes entire areas, and it's framed as a defense, and Palestinians launch some rockets towards Israel, which could be framed as self-defense as well, and it's framed as terrorism and terrorist attacks, and Israel has the right to defend itself, and Israel will defend itself. The layers of that are, you know what? Let's step away from the bombings, because, you know, it's you know, when you talk about war, when you talk about violence, when you talk about escalation, you know, first of all, it's easy because what they've done is dehumanize one side and humanize another, and that's why they're able to portray the news that way. But let's look at some. We talk a lot here in this country about gentrification. And gentrification is almost like a peaceful, even though it's economic violence, it's kind of almost like a peaceful takeover of a space or an area through economic dominance.
It's completely colonial.
It's completely colonial. It's absolutely from the mindset of colonial settlerism. Matter of fact, you know what? I have a great quote. Malcolm X, when he talked about what was happening in Palestine due to pushing people out of their homes. He said, the Israeli Zionists are convinced that they have successfully camouflaged their new kind of colonialism, the colonialism that appears to be more benevolent, more philanthropic, a system which they rule simply by getting the potential victims to accept their friendly offers of economic aid and other tempting gifts, and they dangle in front of the newly independent African nations, because that's who he was talking about, whose economies are experiencing great difficulty. This is the reality. This is the way that it is today. That's what gentrification is in the United States. So now let's go back and look at what was happening the last couple weeks. I'm sure that most of us probably never heard of a neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah. So now Sheikh Jarrah ended up being something that was trending. It was a hashtag. Actually, it was a hashtag that was banned by Twitter, interestingly. So but anyways, what it is you have a neighborhood, you have people who live in this neighborhood that were expelled. They said it was because they didn't pay rent. So what happened was you had some Israelis go to court and get documents saying that in the year 1878 they purchased the land and it was theirs. They've had no claim to it for the last 100 years, by the way. But they say that they had it since 1878. They claimed the land, and they're pushing out people from their homes. First of all, the documents are new documents that falsify old documents, because in 1878, the land of Palestine was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, which I guarantee you was not going to give ownership of anywhere near Jerusalem to Jewish folks, even Muslim folks. It was Ottoman territory. But let's put that to the side. So first of all, it's based off lies. But now let's look at what's happening. So what they did is they start forcing people out of their homes. And luckily, because of social media platforms, we're talking about media, families were able to highlight them being forced out of their homes. And there's some things that went viral. So for example, did you by any chance, Brother Bryson, see the video of the guy saying, well, if I don't steal your home, somebody else is going to steal it? Did you see that video?
No, I did not.
It went viral. So there's a video on there. If you just type Israeli settler, if I don't steal your home, somebody else will. Watch it. It's crazy. So there's this guy telling them, hey, at least you know me. And if I don't steal your home, somebody else is going to steal your home. So move on. And he did. He stole the home. He actually, it hasn't been in the media, but he was interviewed by Vice News, and Vice News, does a good job at forcing themselves into positions and interviewing people. So they ended up interviewing this guy, and they asked him questions. How are you able to have this place? And it's interesting because when he talks, he's definitely American, and he's got a New York accent. So the interviewer asks him, hey, are you from Brooklyn? He goes, I'm from New York. And he's like, they say, so you mean to tell me that you have a right to this property that you don't pay rent for? And you got to watch the interview. That you don't pay rent for. You have the right to live here, but not the people whose grandparents had their parents in these homes, and then those parents had these kids in the homes, and they don't have the right to live there? And he goes, no, absolutely, I have the right. That's why? Because I'm Jewish. If that's not nationalism, here we'd call that white nationalism, wouldn't we? If that's not nationalism, I don't know what is. And then in addition, they interviewed in the same news story the deputy mayor of Sheikh Jarrah. He's an Israeli, of course, an implant. Either him or his parents were immigrants to the land. When they asked him what is his goal for the land, he said, it's my goal to see this land occupied by nothing but Jewish people. And they ask him, so what would happen to the Arabs that live here? And he looks back and he says, it is my goal to see this land occupied by nothing but Jewish people. This is the reality. This is
an ethnic cleansing project.
It's absolutely ethnic cleansing. It's clear. And there's videos every day coming out of people being pushed out of their homes. and nobody's doing anything about it. And we're sitting there and watching. And Israel acts with impunity. They do whatever they want. Yes, the UN continually brings up resolutions decrying the actions of Palestine, and all security members vote in favor of it except one. You know which one, Bryson?
Us.
Us. Why? Why? Let's think about that. Let's think about why that is. Why do we allow them to do whatever? Because guess what? The way they're gentrifying and committing ethnic cleansing on their people, we don't want them to say anything around the world about the way that we treat black and brown bodies here in this country. And it's important that we understand the connection and the tie between black, brown, indigenous, minority populations in this land and people in other lands that are suffering. You can't talk about gentrification, oppression, police brutality if you don't highlight the struggle of Palestinians, if you don't highlight the struggle of Colombians, if you don't, I mean, look what's going on in Colombia. That's a whole nother show, I know, but these are struggles between people that till the soil against people who want nothing but to push them out of those homes.
That's a great frame around how our lives and our freedom struggles are interconnected. I mean, I'm thinking about Angela Davis's work, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, right? Where she's connecting Ferguson, what's happening in Ferguson and happening in Palestine. And what you're highlighting too around the connection between settler colonialism as practiced by the state of Israel upon Palestinian peoples, how that is tied to gentrification in Los Angeles, in New York, you know what I mean, and Oakland, right? You know what I'm saying? These things are tethered together and tied to global capital, and are able to take place because of American military power at the international level and at the local level, the police force, right, within on a domestic level, and how these things connect us one to another. And I agree. Like,
and let's not forget fragility. So it's economic dominance, it's power, and it's also fragility. It's people afraid of losing whatever fragile sense they have of identity. There's so many layers, brother. So many.
Yeah, that's right. Because identities, particularly, you know what I'm saying, white identities are so tethered to the nation building project. You know what I mean? That's and so right. If you call into question, the nation building project, you're calling into question how people understand themselves in the world at a very fundamental level. And so people don't know what to do outside of those mythologies. You know what I'm saying? Their psyche, their spirit collapses. And there's something so tragic about that in the human experience, and most notably expressed in Western countries, that so many folks' identity is tethered to the destruction of other people. You know what I'm saying? And that's just a sad and tragic cycle that freedom movements are always trying to undo and reshape and to imagine and call us into a new way of being human. You know what I'm saying? That's not predicated upon the destruction, you know what I'm saying, of the other.
It's the terrible brainwashing reality that people think that if I lose any of my, if I give any freedom to somebody else, I lose some of my own freedom. They don't realize that when we're all liberated, when we're all free, when we all have the right to life, and we all have the ability to self-determinism, and everybody gains. You don't lose anything. It's like a candle. Like, if you light another person's candle, you don't lose your flame.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Let's hop into another thing. We have some pretty encouraging comments in the chat too. So thankful to let me just shout a couple of folks who have commented: Jim Grant, Beverly Fitzpatrick, Letiona, Mathis Jones. Thank you, Jessica Maldonado, Sabina. Thank you so much for commenting, and for those who are listening but haven't commented, thank you as well. The third question, we're going to even bring this to a local level. So the Central Valley is dominated by Christians, right? Both in the sense of majority of people in the region who have a religious affiliation identify as Christian, but more importantly, conservative Christian theology, it dominates and informs and dominates much of the politics of the region, right? The Central Valley and Fresno. How would you frame the oppression that Palestinians are suffering to the majority Christian culture, to challenge us to live in solidarity with Palestinian people? I know you touched on some of it already, but are there some additional comments you would like to give?
Yeah, so I want to take this in two different directions, if that's possible. So first of all, I would like to say that it's not my job to tell Christians about their theology and how to live. I would push the narrative. I would push the idea that Jesus, in the way Jesus is portrayed in the Bible, in the way that Jesus is portrayed in the Quran, not as somebody who sat by and allowed other people to suffer, who sat by and allowed other people to be at harm, but one who flipped tables and one who rose up. I always like to say that when they talk about Jesus died on the cross, according to Islamic theology, he didn't die on a cross, but that's another story. If I take the Christian story of Jesus and the cross, just simple words. If you say Jesus died on the cross, it's very passive. It's almost, he just let things happen. Jesus was executed for treason.
That's
Jesus
right.
was executed because he raised the plight of people and struggle of poor people, of indigenous people, of people that were marginalized and suffering. And I do not think for a second that were Jesus with us right now in this chat, that he would be even for a second thinking about whether or not he should be supporting the struggle of Palestinian people or any other marginalized or oppressed people around the world. He absolutely would be swinging from that side. That's my first approach to understanding Jesus.
Yeah.
I think I want to talk about something else, though, because it's not my job to tell Christians how to understand Jesus when they think about people that are struggling. I do want to talk a little bit about responsibility. I want to talk about the responsibility of apocalyptic Christianity in Zionism and the setting up and the framing of Israel as it is today, and the oppression, suppression, genocide, and expulsion of Palestinian people, because you cannot talk about the expulsion of Palestinians, the murder of Palestinians, without talking about apocalyptic Christianity. Now, I know that not all Christians are the same. I don't like when people think all Muslims are the same, but we do have to acknowledge that there are Christians, very powerful Christian organizations around the country and around the world that need, I would never utter these words, but they say the killers of Christ. Okay, I don't believe that Jews were the killers of Christ, but they need the killers of Christ to be in power in the Holy Land for the rapture, for Jesus to come back and lift up those who have accepted him. They need that.
Yep.
And that's why so many dollars are poured in to the state. Look, you know what? We all know, I hope all of our listeners have heard of AIPAC. AIPAC is the American Israeli Political Action Committee. It's huge. We all know about it. You basically can't become a president or a politician unless you bow to them.
Right.
That's like the reality. And all of them have bowed to them. It's crazy. We could talk about the politics of AIPAC, but just watching recent, just a few years ago when Donald Trump was at AIPAC, and people were screaming and hooting and hollering for a white supremacist, for a white nationalist, and that should push you in a way. That should push you to think that there's problems in the way that lobbying is done, and we have to have a whole other conversation about lobbying and why people get to access power differently. But we've all heard of AIPAC. How many of us have heard of Kufi? Kufi is the largest pro-Israeli lobbyist in the country, and it's Christians United for Israel. There's 7.5 million members. 7.5 million members. It's led by John Hagee, the televangelists.
Yes. Go. No, I don't want to interrupt. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, and they pour money into. I brought up Truman earlier, and I'm not trying to. I don't like to quote presidents, but even when Truman was thinking about working within his cabinet and how he would accept or not accept the new state of Israel, he literally said that he was worried about the Jewish vote. That thinking has to be changed, because if we're willing to sell out our souls, maybe they don't think they're selling out their souls because they need the rapture to occur. And it's interesting because a lot of these Christian Zionist organizations will take trips to Israel, and they bring people there all the time. Like every week, there's different trips going to visit the Holy Land. And it's sad. You know why? Because I would also love to visit the land where Jesus walked on. That's sacred to me as well. I want to go to Masjid al-Aqsa. I want to pray at the Dome of the Rock. I want to do those things too. But these groups go there with the sole purpose of understanding the Armageddon. They go to Megiddo and they see where that battle's supposed to take place. And they go there just to see how Christians can help, not amplify, hasten the rapture of Jesus. And it's funny because they have Jewish workers, Jewish people that are helping them guide. And I've seen an interview with one of these Christian pastors, and they say, well, when the rapture happens, what's going to happen? And he says, those who've been reborn will be raised up and the rest of them will be destroyed. And they point to one of the Jewish workers that helping him. And they're like, well, what about him? And he's like, well, they'll be left, so they're using them, raising them only to lead them to slaughter. And I know that that's a weird way to look at it, but that's really what it is. So we need to understand Kufi. If we don't look at Kufi and think about why it has so much power and leverage, we're never really going to be able to defeat colonial settlerism there or anywhere, because we have to look at the money and politics and why people are moving. Bryson, me and you, we get to vote. We could give our little few dollars to a politician. We can go knock on doors, but now we're talking about billions and billions of dollars. Right. It's hard to move against that, man. It's really hard. So I'm not the one to tell a Christian how to view their theological understandings. All I'm saying is that if you are a Christian theologian and you are fighting for good things, if you are fighting for justice and equity and racial justice, don't forget the fact that you cannot at the same time uphold and praise theologies, ideas, philosophies, or people that work for the suppression, oppression, and systematic destruction of any other people.
No, that's right. That's right. And I think while you feel that you can tell Christians, what to believe around theology, I can. I mean, that's a part, what I'm saying, like a part of my vocational calling. And I think what you're raising, man, is so critically important around the connection between Christian eschatology and the destruction of Palestinian peoples. I mean, those two things are so linked. You know what I mean? And as in the theology that you're referring to, for those who are listening, is dispensationalism, right? Which is sort of the main way in which Christians in the United States have come to understand how Jesus is going to come back. And a key tenet within dispensational theology is the creation of the nation of Israel. And as Reza pointed out, the creation of the nation of Israel so they can be left behind and destroyed or converted during the age of the Antichrist after Jesus, supposedly raptures Christians into the sky, into eternity. And as someone who, and I'm literally writing about this in my fourth chapter, my dissertation now, and I begin my chapter with a personal story about my dad's concern for me when I was in middle school, because I was so obsessed with the rapture and with dispensationalism. That's when the first Left Behind book came out in 1995. I was watching John Hagee on TV all the time. You know what I mean? And they were always on TV and talking about the rapture. What Israel was doing was God's doing. I mean, it was just so much, and it was always tethered to U.S. empire. And I remember the moment, there's a couple of moments that began to sort of shatter that theology for me. One was a Muslim partner of mine that I grew up with when we were going to City College. We were eating at Wendy's on Blackstone by Fresno City College, and his cousin was from Palestine, and he was chopping it to me about the experiences of Palestinian folks, and I was like, I didn't know. You know what I'm saying? Right? Because I lived within a particular sort of international bubble, if you will. You know what I'm saying? I viewed it through this very Eurocentric Christian lens in terms of eschatology. And so he was chopping to me. So that was like the first sort of piece that began to move me away from that. And then like I just started seeing Hagee's theology was garbage. You know what I'm saying? And like and him and what they were talking about, how problematic it was and how tethered it is to whiteness and to the white racial project. You know what I mean? So we don't have to go all into the details of that, but for those who are listening, you don't have to I believe that you should jettison dispensationalism as your theological orientation towards, the return of Christ, because it's fundamentally tethered to U.S. nation building. You know what I'm saying? And it's support of international military intervention, the oppression of Black folks domestically. Like, there's a lot to talk about there. So maybe we'll end up having a separate conversation, really just kind of detailing out and teasing it out. But for those who are listening, do some research to think differently around this, because people are suffering due to this theological orientation. So I appreciate you bringing up eschatology, and I would add that we can't think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, outside of eschatology, and we can't think about the creation of U.S. ghettos, and we can't think about the creation of U.S. prisons outside of thinking about how it's tied to conceptions of the end of the world also. I have a couple more questions for you, bro, but I want to pause if you don't mind. There's a question in the chat.
Sure.
We rarely get questions in the chat, so I want to it's from our brother Jim Grant, who asked a question, an important question. In denouncing the Israeli occupation of Palestine, how important is it for all of us to not foment anti-Semitism, which is as horrific a toxin as Islamophobia?
Absolutely. So, brother Jim, thanks for your question, man. I always appreciate you. As I said at the beginning, there needs to be a distinction between anti-Zionism, anti-Israeli sentiment, and anti-Semitism. But the reality is that it is very easy to slide from one to the other. It does take some intentionality. I'm hoping that right now I'm talking to a bunch of people who are intentional in their love, intentional in their movement, intentional in their space where they work to create and establish a more just, equitable society for everybody. So in that space, we do need to have conversations about that. You cannot, nobody should ever let their ideas of Israel, their ideas of Zionism slip into a way that it can be pushed into anti-Semitism, a hatred for Jewish brothers and sisters who are dear members of the community, members who work with us. And there are so many Jewish people that stand with Palestinians as well. We can't lump all of Israel together. Not all of the United States agrees with Donald Trump. Yeah, maybe 74 million of them voted for him, but not everybody. So the reality is that we cannot lead into a path where our contempt for a state, for a power, can be seen as a contempt for a people or a religion. Anti-Semitism is on the rise in the United States like no other. It's on the rise around the world. Some of that, unfortunately, I would imagine, is fueled by a distaste for the state of Israel, because the state of Israel portrays itself to be the voice of Jewish people, the power, the stronghold of Jewish people. And unfortunately, people don't take time to disconnect that and really break it down. Look, the reality is, Bryson, Jim, is that when somebody wants to hate, they're going to hate. And they will drive their hatred the way that they need to drive their hatred. I always talk about people who hate Muslims for any particular, they don't need a reason, and they don't need to know that the guy's a Muslim or a Sikh. Somebody hates to hate. If somebody is going to be anti-Semitic, they're going to be anti-Semitic. I personally, and everybody that I know with good intentions and good heart, work really hard to make sure that whatever they're saying is not going to be seen as anti-Semitic. But I won't back down from calling out Zionism and Israel every day of my life if I have to. They're absolutely not tied together for me. It's a myth that they are tied together. It is a myth perpetrated by Jewish people and non-Jews alike, but it's a myth nevertheless. So the problem is that people ask us to be silent, to not say anything, to not stand on the corners, to not get involved, because you will be seen as anti-Semitic, you will be seen as hating Jewish people, and that is just, again, another way to silence us. and I won't fall for that.
No,
I'm
that's
not going to be hoodwinked and bamboozled, as Malcolm said.
that's right. Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, there's a way in which the very real atrocity atrocities that historically that have happened to our Jewish kin in Europe have created a sort of narrative around to silence folks to not speak out against Israel. And you can do both. Like you can because I mean anti-Semitism is sort of foundational to European to Europe and the creation of the nation. I mean the Jews were sort of the first kind of internal enemy of Europe, designated as Christ killers, and anti-Semitism is sort of is central to the European colonial project.
Hey, and Bryson, we brought up John Hagee, or anybody like John Hagee, that his goal is either the conversion or destruction of Jewish people, so the rapture can happen. You telling me that's not anti-Semitic? And they're pro-Zionist, pro-Israeli.
That's right.
So you have to be able to understand that as well.
Yeah, he's the biggest one. And one thing too, if we can kind of just briefly just even return to the Hagee piece, and a friend of mine was really explaining to me some months ago sort of the role of these kind of Christian Zionist organizations in targeting Black pastors, right, to go to the Holy Land and to get them on their side, on Israel's side, and to not, to think about, to care about what's happened to Palestinian folk. And so, and it's easy, I feel like, for some Black clergy to kind of appropriate that narrative, because that's the narrative, the eschatology that we already have in many ways operating in some of our churches, particularly for us Black folks who have been in more evangelical adjacent spaces. You know what I mean? And so there's a lot of work to do within Black Christian communities to help us think through these connections, these theologies, for us to stand in solidarity and do freedom work. And there's some good folks who I know who are doing that work. You know what I mean? And raising that awareness and doing that theological formation. You know what I'm saying, for Black Christian kin, so that we don't get tethered and tied to the destruction of other human beings. Yeah. Jim, I hope that Reza's answer suffice for you. If you're still in the chat, you can drop something in. Let me push on to another question. Hold on, my son is knocking on the door. Hold on, one quick.
Hey, this is what happens with live TV, man, or live broadcast, man.
Exactly. Yeah, he was just at the park with my wife. Hey, Ansel. So the fourth question is, as a Muslim faith leader in the Central Valley, how has the oppression of Palestinian people informed your own social justice work? And how do you understand, we've already touched on some of this, but how do you understand the intersections between what the oppressive conditions in which Palestinians live to what is happening domestically with Black people? You've touched on some of that, but if you want to elaborate on either one of those.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm going to say that for me, as a Muslim, justice is the central theme for everything that I need to do. I'm supposed to be working to establish and create justice. The Quran says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kunu qawamina bil qist. O you who believe, stand up and establish justice. Stand firm for justice. So according to my religious tradition, I have no choice but to stand up and establish justice. There's a hadith. I always like to share this saying of Prophet Muhammad. I'm sure you've heard me say it, Bryson. The Prophet said, if you see something wrong, if you see an injustice in the land, stop it with your hands. If you can't, speak out against it with your tongue. If you can't, hate it in your heart. But that's the least of faith. It's my goal. It is my theological drive and my theological purpose to work to establish justice on earth, however that looks, whenever that comes up. So for me, Palestine is an issue. You know what? The suffering of people in Colombia is an issue. The suffering of the Black body at the hands of state-run police is an issue. All of these are issues that are supposed to drive me in my work. Now, as a Muslim, of course, Palestine takes on another level of care and activism, because For Muslims, Christians, and Jews, Jerusalem is one of the holiest sites in the world. And to see, one of the earliest built treasures, the Dome of the Rock and Masjid al-Aqsa, being under siege and under attack, and a fear that it can be destroyed. Israeli soldiers are incursioning on it like every day almost. So to see that, of course, it heightens my sense of a need to call and cry out for justice. What's interesting is when we think about the intersections between oppressive conditions of Palestinians and Black people. First of all, again, we know that Jewish brothers and sisters have always been around in the struggle for justice in this land, right? So there have always been Jewish people that stood up with Black people and cried out for justice. So this is, again, not about Jewish folks. This is about Zionism and Israel. When it comes to that, even when Black leaders throughout recent history or not that long ago were working with Jewish people, they still were willing to call out Zionism. We could look at SNCC. I already talked about Malcolm X. You could look at the Black Panther Party. All of them had strong words for the state of Israel, and they connected their struggle to the struggle of Palestinians. And we flash forward all the way till today, and the Black Lives Matter movement, where they have expressed absolute, unequivocal solidarity and unity with the struggle of Palestinians. So, there's always been an understanding of Black people fighting for freedom and justice, that they needed to be broader in their approach, and that, if people were struggling in Colombia, or people were struggling in Mexico, or people were struggling in Cuba, that was always tied to the struggle of Black people in this country, because they understood that as long as the colonial mindset could flourish anywhere, it would continue to flourish here. And there was a work to deconstruct that. But and by the way, one thing I would like to say, I'm just going to be stealing this from my wife, Sakina. She had an amazing speech at one of the rallies, but she talked about something that's so real. She said, if you care about access to water, Palestinians don't have water.
That's
if
right.
you care about access to resources, Palestinians don't have. If you care about not being imprisoned, Palestinians are imprisoned. If you care about gentrification, domination, forceful expulsion, that's what Palestine. If you care about the genocide of indigenous brothers and sisters, they are witnessing genocide right now. If you care about people being murdered, if you care about people being abused, if you care about police brutality, let's talk about police brutality. Let's talk about the way we're being policed. Let's talk about the fact that police chiefs and departments throughout this country send their people to Israel to learn from the IDF tactics to police. I do not want to be policed the way that they police Palestinians. Do you, Bryson?
Yeah,
I do not want to. And you know what? We just 1 year ago and a couple of weeks, 1 year and a week, we saw a knee on the neck of George Floyd. That's not new. They've always had the necks on their knees on the necks of Black people in this country. But we saw it, right? If you go online and just type knee on neck Israel, go look at how many Palestinian kids, women, pregnant people got knees on their necks from the. Where do you think they learned that? Of course, policing in the United States already has a long history of oppressing, of holding down, of trying to protect the economic vibrancy of white America. Really, that's what it's all about. But so I'm not going to say that they learned how to police from that, but I guarantee you, if you go and look at the connections between how they are being trained by the IDF in these last couple decades, you will find an absolute connection between the IDF and the security forces in Israel and the tactics and militarization of police here in these lands. There's an absolute, unequivocally, you cannot deny the connection, and they are proud about it. They advertise it, and this goes back to the trips to Israel with our Black pastor brothers and sisters who are going. Let me ask you, Bryce, you got a free trip to Israel. You want to turn it down? Here's a free trip to go and visit the land that Jesus walked on. Here, take this free trip and go see where John the Baptist was. Take this free trip and go see where Mary was. Take this free trip and go see where Jesus was marched. Go see. I would go. It's really hard not to go.
I'm gonna tell you straight up though, if if a conservative evangelical offers me to go on that trip, I'm not going, fam.
Yeah, I'm not going. But what I'm saying is it's very hard to turn that down.
But it's very difficult. I hear what you're saying.
Us can afford a trip to Israel to see
right.
that.
Yeah, that's right.
So now here it is. It's free.
Yeah, it's free. Yeah.
And what they do is they only take you where they want to take you. You know,
right.
You've seen birthright trips. You know, birthright trips is one of the greatest injustices in that land that I've seen, that you take people from around the world who have no tie to the land and you give them a free trip to where they have a right to citizenship, while people that have been for generations been there have no right to citizenship or self-determinism. But anyways, we've seen videos of birthright trips where people are standing up and saying, why don't you take us to the occupied territories? Jewish people, why don't you take us and show us what you're doing to Palestinians? And they don't. There's a reason for that. There's an absolute connection to the oppression of Palestinians, to the oppression of black and brown bodies here in this nation, to the oppression of Colombians who are standing up right now just for the basic rights to existence.
There's a text that I have not read myself, but I'm going to order because it's going to be on my summer reading list. And black folks I know who study this and are involved in these freedom movements with Palestinian folks have recommended this book called Black Power in Palestine, Transnational Countries of Color by Michael R. Fishbach. And I haven't read this book myself, but this has come highly recommended to me by several folks, for those of you who might be interested in this.
And you brought up Angela Davis earlier. Read her writings on
Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Abolition, Democracy. You know what I'm saying? Those are key pieces. You know, where she's laying out the intersections between the two intersections that I didn't know existed until I read Freedom is a Constant Struggle. You know what I mean? I knew that there were intersections, but I didn't know how entrenched they were into U.S. life and the oppression of black folks. This next comment it seems anecdotal, but it's tethered to what we're talking about. When I was living in Chicago, I asked a friend of mine. I was like, the police out here, they ride 4 deep, and I was like, I'm not used to that. Like in Cali, they ride 1 or 2 deep. There's a bunch of them.
Wait, there's police sitting in the back seats in Chicago?
In the back seats. Back seats. And what this person, a friend of mine who's familiar with, who was more familiar with sort of U.S. law enforcement's connection to Israeli policing, was saying that they learned those tactics in Israel, and they brought that tactic back. And it's a very real. This is a domestic enemy that we're policing. You know what I mean? Very upfront about that. And so. So there's definite not implicit but explicit connections, and I'll name it as such. Our former police chief, you know what I'm saying, in Fresno, took a trip, to Israel, and claimed.
Yeah, that was my first interaction with him, because well, you know what happened. I don't want to share this in public, but my first interaction was after his trip there, and he was. It was advertised, and I was unhappy with the fact that he went there. But if you even look at what he said, he witnessed, terrible things, but he said it was a learning curve for him. Like, what does that tell you? What does that tell you?
Yeah.
Their lobbying is strong. Their dollars. Speak about dollar. We give them $3.8 billion a year. They got healthcare. You don't have healthcare. They got free education. You don't have free education. They have everything you don't have because of that $3.8 billion. Minimally, look at that, $3.8 billion. Those are some numbers we all need to remember. $3.8 billion a year to a country like a little tiny country. And let's think of another number, 7 million. Let's not forget that today there are 7 million Palestinians living as refugees in diaspora, and no right to return, without citizenship anywhere. So these are numbers that we should remember as well.
And giving $3 billion to a settler colonial state, but claiming that there's no money for reparations. I mean, we're owed way more.
There's no money to pay off your student debt. I know you guys.
No money for student debt. I got a couple bumps. There's no money for universal health care. There's no money for universal pre-K for my young one right here. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's just the contradictions in this country. And I'm not saying anything new. Folks have highlighted this. I've written on other people. I've written on this. But our moment, this COVID-19, the cascading of the murder of George Floyd, COVID-19, it put all of the hypocrisies of this country on full display.
Front
and
stage,
and I'm not,
center,
you know, and
spotlight.
everything. And I'm not one. My theology isn't that sort of, my theology isn't that God, sanctioned George Floyd to die, or that God caused the coronavirus. That's not my theology. But I do believe that the Spirit is operating amidst tragedies to say, do you see? You know what I mean? Can you see what's happening? Because everything is on display. The hypocrisies and the contradiction on display. And choose you this day who you will serve. You know what I mean?
Right.
Will you still bow to the altar of white supremacy and the idolatry of capitalism, the twin idolatries of those things? Or will you heed the ancient call of the Spirit to create something new, to where everyone can flourish? You know what I'm saying? And like, and we are in another, it's like we're in the constant moment of crisis in this country, and that if we don't pull it together in a way of reimagining who we are with one another, there's going to be deep conflict that people, I don't think, are really ready for.
I know I keep quoting Malcolm. It's just the love that I have. But he talked about. He said that, and this we're talking about in the '60s. He said this. So let's flash forward. It's as if he's talking today. He said we have the opportunity to be witnesses to the first bloodless revolution here in the United States if we are willing to do the right thing. Revolutions all over the world, people struggling, oppressed people struggling is never bloodless. But he says here we could have the first bloodless revolution, and that was in the '60s. So if his word holds still today, we have the ability and the opportunity to reimagine an America where we actually all belong, and it's not just some words written up on a piece of paper somewhere, but an America where we all actually belong. We have the ability to do that. But we got to have some tough conversations. We got to be self-critical. And I think we need to be willing to throw away a lot of what we have and hold dear. You talked about white supremacy and, you talk. I don't remember what the word was that you used, but predatory economics, capitalism.
Capitalism, yeah.
Martin Luther King threw in the third one, militarism, right? So, these are the three that all need to be deconstructed. And then we can reimagine really a world where you and me belong, where we're not some side thing and we're not marginal. We're not just hovering in some shadows because we don't have the ability to stand up and be who we really are and live out what we can live out, right?
Exactly. And our life chances increase, right? You know what I'm saying? To where all these things aren't sort of abstract concepts. They're leading to early death. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
People are literally dying. Children are dying. You know what I'm saying? And people who are oppressing are being deeply malformed also. You know what I'm saying? And disciplined and discipled into evil practices. You know what I mean? And as a Christian, I stand against that. That is antichrist. You know what I'm saying?
And you as a Christian and me as a Muslim, we also believe that people can change.
That's right.
So these people can they can reimagine themselves.
That's right.
I mean, we can look at, there's countless narratives of those people around Jesus, around Muhammad, who were doing terrible things and reimagine themselves. And now we honor them. We love them. We look back at them. So this is a call to all of you, if you're a pastor, if you're a police officer, if you're a politician, whatever you do in your life, if you are living in a way that is holding somebody else down, you can reimagine yourself, recreate yourself, and be somebody that we can later on look back at and love. But you got to make that decision.
Nah, that's right. I mean, and within the Christian tradition, one of our central figures is Paul.
Right. Right.
Paul was a terrorist on behalf of the Roman, of the Jewish elite and the Roman Empire. Really,
did he call himself like a Christian killer?
Yeah, you know what I'm saying. He was the Christ, or he was a. I forget. I should know that. I forget the term just right off bat that used for him in Acts that described him as. You know what I'm saying. But yeah, Paul was a bad dude, man. But he met, he met the risen Savior on that Damascus road and transformed himself into something new. And that invitation, for whatever our faith orientations exists for us. That invitation to transform into something new.
Even to give your own life and fight for it. In my tradition, there's you'd have to look it up. It's a long story about Imam Al-Hussein, who is the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, who ends up having to stand up with a small group of 72 people against an army of dozens of thousands. And interestingly, so it's the Muslim ruler who is going to slaughter the grandson of the Prophet. It's a story that one needs to look at. But there's a man called Hur, and he is a general in the army on the other side. And he comes to Imam Hussein and he tells him, what are you doing? What can we do? Let's talk. You don't need to die. Imam Hussein says, no, we're not. Famous quotes from Imam Hussein we talk about today. The quote, I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees. That comes from this battle.
Yay, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So, you know why? Because everybody likes to take away the credit from Muslims. It became an unknown quote on the internet, right? But it goes to Imam. Anyhow, so, but this person who was fighting on the other side, he says that I saw hell on one side and heaven on the other side, and he leaves his army and he becomes one of the first people to be killed by the army that he left, standing up to defend what's right. Even on our last day, we can make that choice.
Wow.
So and then guess what? I remember Hur today. I remember his name. I remember his struggle. I remember who he is. I love who he is. I pledge my allegiance. I wish I was there to do what he did. I don't know the name of the guy who killed him. So do you want to be one that's forgotten as a killer, as an oppressor, as a suppressive person, as somebody or do you want to be a hero who stood up? You want to be somebody who, like, what do you guys always say, Bryson? What do you guys always? You can choose. All of our religious leaders. You can be what? You can be a prophet of the resistance or a chaplain to the empire.
Yeah.
You get to decide.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true, man. With that decision rests at our feet every day. And family, Reza, this is our time has come to a conclusion. Man, thank you so much. This was a beautiful conversation, and for those who are listening, hopefully this was informative for you. As Reza noted, I mean, each piece that he touched on has so much more that he could have gone into, but this was, an introductory sort of conversation for many of us. So please feel free to reference this. This will be on the Faith in the Valley website. This will also be kept on our Faith in the Valley Facebook page. Please refer to it. And also, what I'll do is compile some text and video and conversation with Reza and send to our list for people to be able to read and to think about, to inform them on what's taking place to Palestinian people. And so thank you again, fam. And looking forward to continuing to build and to see the great work that you're doing in Fresno on behalf of Palestinian folk.
Thanks, Bryson. I just want to say to you, thank you. I appreciate you. And I particularly want to appreciate the fact that you were willing and wanting to have this conversation when organizations around the country are unwilling for whatever reason. I don't want to get into the money of it, but I'm really thankful that you were willing to have this conversation, and I hope that we can keep it going.
Yep, indeed. We definitely will, fam. Let's end the broadcast. Peace, y'all. Much love.